Welcome, and thanks for joining us for the Rock Solid Apologia Podcast, where we discuss Christian apologetics, worldviews, and so much more. We're so glad that you're listening with us today. Feel free to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to keep up with all the latest news over at RSA. Now, on to today's podcast episode.
Welcome to the world's one and only apologetic satire podcast. You're listening to Micah and Will from Rock Solid Apologia. The year is 2021, and English class is just about over. The class has spent the period discussing an essay from transgender Minneapolis City Councilman Andrea Jenkins on transgenderism. Nothing but affirmation is expressed for Mr. Jenkins's newfound identity as Mrs. Jenkins. Towards the end of the class, the Christian speaks up to object to the author's liberal use of profanity throughout the essay. Heatedly, many hands in the class go up to respond to the Christian's seemingly innocent objection. What do you, as the Christian, do? It's you against the class. Are there other Christians in the class? You wouldn't know because they never vocalize their convictions. How do you respond? Greg Koukl joins us on the world's one and only apologetic satire podcast to discuss with students who have been in the hot seat, like the one discussed earlier, to help us navigate those tough situations. Greg Koukl's new book, Street Smarts, Using Questions to Answer Christianity's Toughest Challenges, is written for just that purpose, a follow-up to his best-selling book, Tactics. Mr. Koukl models the use of questions to both defend your faith and get out of tight situations. Welcome to the world's one and only apologetic satire podcast, Mr. Koukl. It is fantastic to have you.
Well, thank you, Micah and Will. I'm looking forward to our chat. I love the little intro there about the not a hypothetical, but apparently something that actually happened, and all kinds of things came to mind when you were talking about that. So I'm looking forward to working out the details here together.
Well, can you give us a little bit of your background as well as where listeners can find more of you, and maybe plug for your book a little bit as well?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to do that. I'm in a little bit of a strange thing, in a sense, speaking now to a younger group and Gen Zs, et cetera, because I didn't become a Christian until I was 23 years old. But that was 1973. That was 50 years ago. That's a long time. So I'm aware in a certain sense of a liability that some people might think that I'm not part of this generation, so I have a different set of background and values and everything else. But nevertheless, I think the kinds of things that we're going to talk about here today are pan-generational, so to speak, or transgenerational, make a bad pun there, to apply to everybody in conversations everywhere. And I became a Christian in 73, but it was about I was 23 years old, and it was in the Jesus movement here in Southern California. And I did not become a Christian because of apologetics. And that's very different from many of my colleagues in this area, maybe that you'd be interviewing in the future or have done in the past, but where apologetics entered into their whole process of making a decision to follow Jesus. It was different for me. I can't even explain it, except for I just got hit with the gospel so many times, especially by my brother. It all started to sink in. And then finally, I just had this deep, profound sense that it was really true. And it wasn't until after I became a Christian that I started checking out apologetics, because I needed to engage people. And back in the 60s and the early 70s, the Jesus movement and everything, all the radical trends, the cross-cultural things that are going on, then I just needed to answer some of these challenges, and I started to learn. There weren't too many players out then. There were only 5 people that I can think of that kind of dealt with apologetics with any visibility. One of them was Walter Martin. Another one was Norm Geisler, who just went to be with the Lord last year, or earlier this year, I guess. Another was Josh McDowell. He's still in play. Another was John Montgomery. I just saw him 3 weeks ago. He's 92 years old, and he's still in play. And the other one was Francis Schaeffer. So I learned, and who died in the 80s, but I learned a lot from Schaeffer, some from McDowell, a lot from Lewis, part of not the American tradition, but the British. So these are guys that really began to influence my thinking. And then in 1990, I started to do commercial radio, a 3-hour Saturday, 3-hour Sunday, but it was a Christian station. And when we started Stand to Reason in 1993, I shifted. I had already actually begun to shift my format and answer, not deal with news items, but it start trying to give commentaries that were relevant to the news that I cared about, and then to open the lines for calls, and people began calling in. Now I'm in my 33rd year of radio. Actually, I'll start the 34th here in about a month, and interacting with critics, interacting with other Christians who needed help with challenges, interacting with Christians who had different theologies than I did. And they're all through this process. And then really in that period of time, I've spoken on more than 93 college and university campuses, and I've done a lot of other things too. But it put me in a position to engage a lot with others who didn't share my convictions, and to learn the more effective ways of doing that. And of course, the more effective ways turn out to be the biblical ways, defend the faith. Yeah, we love that. 1 Peter 3:16, but with gentleness and reverence. Oh, who put that in there, So all of these things became characteristic of Stand to Reason. Now 30 years this year in existence, where we're training Christians to think more carefully about their convictions and to be able to defend classical Christianity and classical Christian values. That is, the values that flow naturally from a Christian understanding of reality. And in 30 years, it's been really great to see what God has done through Stand to Reason. I've written a number of books that kind of reflect these, the things that I've learned in engagement. And I think it's made me a much more successful, maybe that's not the best word, much more effective, I think is a better word, ambassador for Christ. And the reason that I mentioned, I changed my wording there is because what a successful evangelist is, or a successful Christian telling others about Christ, is not somebody who wins a lot of people to Christ, but somebody who is faithful to Christ in the way they do it and in the content of their information. Let God worry about the other. Yet we can still work at becoming effective ambassador for Christ. And that's what we focus in on at Stand to Reason, being a good ambassador for Christ. And we let God take care of the rest.
And you've got a new book out, Street Smarts, correct?
Yes, that's right. The subtitle is Using Questions to Answer Christianity's Toughest Challenges. It's actually a sequel to a book that we were talking about before off the air, Tactics, a game plan for discussing your Christian convictions. And that lays out the foundational way that we interact and a whole bunch of different maneuvers we can use in conversations with people. There's 3 steps to that game plan. We'll probably get into that shortly. But Street Smarts takes that game plan to another level. For those familiar with for those who are familiar with tactics, what Street Smarts does is it takes the 3rd step of the game plan, which means you're using questions to make a point, and it puts it on steroids, okay? Dealing with a whole bunch of different issues, like there's 2 chapters on atheism, there's a chapter on the problem of evil, there's a chapter on gender, sex, and marriage, there are 2 chapters on Jesus, there's 2 chapters on the Bible and challenges people have with that. There are 2 chapters on abortion. So there's all these things that are part of the conversation right now that young people and older people are facing, but more powerfully, I think, younger people in the university environment, with your friends and those influenced by that kind of conversation. And so that's why something like Street Smarts is valuable, because it doesn't just work on the game plan or provide the game plan somewhat conceptually like I do in a tactics book, but it then gets into the substance of the problems of all of those issues that you can then expose those problems by using questions in a very particular way. And so Street Smarts is quite a bit longer than tactics because I got a lot of dialogues in there with the example questions and helping the people to see, readers to see how those dialogues unfold a bit. And I'm pretty sure we're going to do some of that too as the interview progresses. Pardon me. So I look forward to that.
Those dialogues were personally my favorite part of the book, Because it's like, oh yeah, okay, that would be an interesting question to ask in this context. And you usually come up with the best questions afterwards, not actually in the moment, and then you just gotta figure it out next time.
Yes, that's right. Will, you've touched on something really important, and that is actually, for one, this is a process. So everybody starts at the beginning. Okay, I don't want people comparing themselves to me or other people that are in my position. You have to start at the beginning, and I'll explain how to do that in a very simple and safe fashion. But you just have to start at the beginning, and then as you get used to conversations guided by the game plan, what's going to happen is, as you look back in prior conversations, you say, oh, I could have done this or that, coulda, shoulda, woulda. Okay, well, you think through it in a productive way, and then you're ready for the next time that particular issue comes up, and you'll have a question maybe to use to initiate a conversation in a much more effective way.
And eventually you figure out, okay, that didn't work. Try this time. And
Right.
eventually, unfortunately for me, it's a lot of trial and error. That conversation didn't go great. But to set up
I've had plenty of those, by the way.
some of the scenarios in the university, in your book, Street Smarts, you describe the next generation, my generation's attitude, rather accurately, in my opinion, as to them being the next generation. Christianity is simply about believing in Jesus in some vague sense, being nice and loving people in a can't we all just get along sort of way.
Yeah.
So give us a sense from your perspective where our generation's at.
Well, first of all, just a clarification, I think I was referring more to the Christians in our generation who have a kind of a watered down message. And so I actually don't think the generation at large has a can't we just all get along attitude at all. It's very aggressive with leftist ideas. And if you don't go along with those, you're not just persona non grata. You can really get attacked and even, lose your livelihood because you don't believe the right things, or at least you don't say you believe the right things. I think that the Christians are in three categories here, if I was to give an assessment. One are Christian in name only, all right? And that is that they go to church, but it's no big deal. It doesn't really have any influence on anything else they do in their lives, really. Except for maybe in a moralistic way. And you probably heard of the term moralistic therapeutic deism. Christian Smith and Melinda, I can't think of her last name, but they wrote a book in 2005, and they assessed the church in that way. Young people are just like, okay, God exists and I'm supposed to be nice. That's really what it amounted, and be happy. So moralistic therapeutic deism, and no real depth and understanding. Okay. Then you have, I'm going to push to the opposite end of the spectrum. So these people are largely Christian in name only, and they're not really have any theological depth. Then on the other extreme are the kinds of people that I meet at reality conferences. Like we just had one in Minneapolis 2 weekends ago, and there were 3,800 students there, almost 4,000. And we do 6 of these around the country, and we sell out every venue, and Minneapolis is the largest venue we have, so we put in 4,000 people there. But I meet people in those groups. They come up to me, and these are young people, like 13, 14, 15 years old, and they are on fire for Jesus. They have biblical education. A lot of them are homeschooled, so they get regular biblical education from their folks. They understand Scripture. They understand the Christian worldview largely, and they want to make a difference for Christ. So that's the other end of the spectrum. Then you got all these people in the middle, and these are people that are it's hard to know what their roots look like, okay, because they're on a good trajectory as Christians, but they don't have much theological depth, and they're not all interested so much in apologetics, making the case. And that's because their interests are largely with their friends and their activities and stuff like this. I got teenagers myself here at home, both girls. So I know how that kind of works. But these are people that, as a mixture, I think, of wheat and chaff, some that genuinely know Christ, others that are kind of along for the ride for the moment. What matters is what happens when the wind starts blowing real hard on them. Do they blow away with the chaff, or they stand firm, kind of deal? And you can't know that until things get tough. But there's a mixture in that group too. And so I'm largely, what we're looking to do is equip, a stand to reason, to equip that first group I mentioned, and then also to challenge and equip that third group I mentioned, the one that's kind of in the middle. So I want people that are gung-ho, we're trying to feed them aggressively, like you guys. Here we're doing what we can to, when I say we, I mean people in my colleagues and stuff, especially stand to reason. But then people that are maybe on the fence, I want them to see what reality really looks like. And it isn't what they're hearing from the world. That's false. It's what God actually says about the world. And what's interesting is it's not just a leap of faith. You're not trying to believe in unicorns, even though you have no visibility of unicorns. He's telling, the scripture tells us things about the world that are true. And we know they're true because we can match those statements to the world, that human beings are beautiful and broken. There's something unique and beautiful about human beings. Oh, we can see that. And then there's something terrible about them at the same time. And not just in humanity in general, but in each person. Oh, yeah, they're broken. So the Bible says that it matches reality, is the point I'm making. And so we want them to take reality seriously and walk with Jesus in an effective fashion, not just for themselves, but being an ambassador for Christ to go out into the world.
So specifically for those folks that are really on fire for God and they like apologetics, and I started researching apologetics when COVID came around and I had time, and I would spend hours in the evenings listening to apologetics.
Yeah.
For those they're listening to apologetics, they're very interested, but they have no idea, per se, what to do with it, where to start with taking that out to the world. What would you recommend for people like that?
Well, that's a good question. It's very simple to answer. The first thing they can learn to do is to ask the right questions. Now, I see you chuckling there, Will, because you know where I'm going with this. Both Street Smarts and its earlier book, Tactics, which Street Smarts builds upon, employs a game plan. And by the way, you don't need Tactics to benefit from Street Smarts. The game plan and foundational material is all repeated there in Street Smarts. It's standalone, but it'd be really good if you had Tactics too, because there's lots of things that are in Tactics that are not in Street Smarts. But it's meant to, the game plan entails using questions in a very particular way that will allow you not only get good information from the other person, but also keeps you tremendously safe at a conversation. The way I put it is you're ankle deep in the shallow end of the pool. There's no risk at all. Sometimes when we think about engaging people, it's like not being able to swim very well, but just, okay, I'm going to jump into the deep end. Well, you jump into the deep end and you may sink. Okay, that's not what I'm asking. If you get used to the game plan, elements of it, by using questions in a very safe way, you're going to find out that it's a lot easier to maneuver than you thought, and it's safe. Think about this, fellas. If you are asking questions, just like you're doing now, you're asking questions. You're not really advancing your view. So how am I going to attack either of you if you haven't made a claim that's controversial that I disagree with? I can't attack you. I can't say you're wrong because you haven't said anything specifically about your view. What you're doing here just in this interview is largely asking about my view. Okay. You had little hints. Obviously, you guys are Christian podcasters, so and YouTubers. So there's a little thing. Yeah, well, I agree with that. But then you go into something else. But notice the dynamic. The person who is asking the questions is not doing most of the talking. The guy who's asked is doing most of the talking. In my case, it's extra most. But you're in the driver's seat of the conversation. This discussion is going exactly in the direction that you want it to go because of the way you use your questions. And that's a principle I want people to get in their mind, because it makes things so much easier if you ask the right questions. And so the game plan employed in Tactics and in Street Smarts is a game plan that uses questions in a very particular way.
So I wanted to walk through, and we'll get into what that game plan is. And I've shamelessly stole from it on numerous occasions in class. Walk some of our listeners, especially the younger ones, through a series of scenarios, except one of which I've actually been through, all experiences from my time at school, and get your input on how to respond.
Okay.
And hopefully, I mean, this is not just a personal thing. It's just, I thought, you know what, if Mike and I go with personal experiences, there'll probably be a bit more reflective of what people listening run up against.
Yeah, I think I saw the material that you sent me in advance, and I think that these are great. And the thing is, you are in a ideologically hostile environment, whether it's high school or college or whatever. And consequently, that's the real deal. You're in the battle. So you know what kind of challenges there are that people are facing. And those are great examples or opportunities to demonstrate how the tactical game plan works.
So a few years ago, I was in a class, and I actually, I mean, as far as it goes, I thought the world of the professor. But we were reading an essay by Andrea Jenkins, as was referenced in the introduction. And he is a he that thinks he is a she.
Yeah.
And what I was not going to go, I mean, in that environment, you don't go saying that transgenderism is wrong. You start asking people questions. So I started off with, this individual liberally used the F word.
Yeah.
His essay, and I thought, you know what? Could you have made it more effective had you not used it? But the response was, the whole class hands go up. They want to reply. Well, he's just angry. He has every right to be angry. Et cetera, et cetera. The arguments.
In other words, they were defending him in the use of language, right?
Yep, and his stance on transgenderism as well.
Yeah. Wow. Well, there's a lot of things when I read that piece in advance. A lot of things I thought of, directions you could go. So I'm going to lay out a couple of thoughts and some principles, and then we'll take this wherever you want to go with it. On the one hand, when dealing with individuals, okay, or people in general, on the one hand, you don't expect Christians to live like non-Christians. I'm sorry, the other way around. You don't expect Christians to live like non-Christians, but we can't expect non-Christians to live by our ethic, okay? Even if it's right and true, they are given to their ways with their own view of the world and their own habits and what they think is right and wrong. And so that is probably not going to change much until they start taking Christianity seriously and they enter into being a follower of Jesus. Then there's a transformation. You see the world in a different way, and that changes everything. Changed me so much in the mid-70s when I became a Christian at 23 years old. Okay, so on the one hand, here's a principle in play. If I'm walking around, hanging around with a lot of non-Christians, I'm not going to say, hey, quit cussing around me. I'm not going to say that, even though it bothers me. Now, if my daughters were present, I would ask for that as a courtesy to my daughters, all right, and make that kind of appeal. But nevertheless, generally speaking, you don't want to act like you're bugged because they're not living the way you live. Okay, that's a general principle. But there are times when there are exceptions. Classroom environment is interesting because it is the place to play with ideas and throw things out and see what's going on. Excuse me. But then you have a lot of vulnerability there because nobody's on your team and everybody's against you. Okay, that doesn't mean you can't talk, but you want to make sure that you have your tactical ducks in a row, so to speak, so that you'll be able to anticipate and respond to in a useful way, a helpful way, the challenges that are offered to you. Now, I'm kind of curious. I'm not sure exactly what question you asked to initiate this issue in your class. Do you remember what it was, Will?
It was something to the effect of, I understand why someone would be angry and use profanity, but wouldn't they have made a better case, gotten more people on board if they just left it out?
Oh, that's interesting.
Because I said, I went to a middle school where people swore all the time. It's like, I don't like it, but it's not like I'm sensitive to it. I mind it. It's just like it
Sure, I
seems
get you.
like this individual is wrecking his case needlessly by
Right.
being too explicit, too gross, too profane, and he's not trying to build any common ground with anybody.
Oh, okay. So this is a very interesting question, because you are approaching his language on a strategic basis and not on a moral basis,
Oh
which
yeah.
is very clever, because it's like you're saying, listen, Professor, I have a suggestion that could help you make your case more persuasively to people who disagree. Okay. And if you're interested in that. And so maybe that's the way you could have started. And say, if you're interested in that, are you interested in being more persuasive to people who disagree with you? Let him answer. Now, if he says yes, he's interested. Now he's giving you a little permission. Okay, I'm just going to role play it with myself here. Okay, just to show you how I might have played this out. Because in these kind of circumstances, especially when you have hostels, you want to take itty bitty steps that are very simple. In other words, and they are the answer, you anticipate the answer because of the way you ask the question in light of their values. All right. Because when they're going to be putting these pieces on the table, you're going to use that against them. And so there's a certain sense in which, instead of just saying your view, which will get a lot of pushback, you are enlisting the other person as an aid to help you. And I talk about that in some detail in Street Smarts. That is the essence of Street Smarts. There is this technique. So I guess, I have a little time to think about it. I would say, are you interested in being? I have some ideas that might make your way of presenting things more persuasive to people who might disagree with you. Are you interested in that, being more persuasive to others? Okay. And if he says yes, then I'd say, would you say those people who don't hold your view, would you say that they're more conservative or more liberal or in the middle? What do you think he's going to say?
Obviously more conservative.
Yes, more conservative. Okay. Okay, right. So what you are interested in doing is persuading conservative people to hold your view about transgenderism, right? Okay. Do you think that the language that you've been using, all of the F-bombs and all that, do you think that's going to make it easier for them to accept your message or harder for them to accept your message? Okay, now that's a little bit of a mic drop moment, right?
Yeah.
Because okay, well, he's already said he's interested in persuading, learning something that will help us be more persuasive, and he's already acknowledged that he's trying to persuade conservative types. And so now you're saying, hey, conservative types don't like this kind of thing. So if you change your language, do you think that'd be more effective? So now you're criticizing his language, not in a moral way, but in a strategic way. It's the same thing that I would tell to other Christians. Hey, you're really, you're banging this guy's head, like being nasty. You're mad. He's mad. Who's going to change their mind when they're mad or somebody's mad at them? If anybody gets mad, I lose, is my line. I think I have it in the book, Street Smarts. If anybody gets mad, I lose. So this is, again, just a strategic issue. We're trying to be a kind of person. So that's something that you might offer him. Okay. Now, what's great about this is you are chastising his language, but not as an outsider. So far, from what you said, nobody knows what your particular views are. You didn't even tell him not to say that kind of stuff. It's wrong to say it. You just said it's not persuasive.
Yeah.
A gentle answer turns away wrath. That's Proverbs. Okay. Harsh word stirs up anger. So you share that with him. You say, what do you think? And then let him respond. Okay. Now, if you want to take a step further and get moral about it, that's another step. If you want to communicate to him, the way you're talking here is not good. It's not right. All right. So, but you have to snare these folks with their own ethical view. Now, they've got a lot of jargon, a lot of sloganeering that they do that is meant to explain a moral principle that allows them to do whatever they want. You can use that against them. Okay. So it would be, do you think we ought to be sensitive to other people's beliefs and convictions, like you're offering a defense of transgender? Do you think people who disagree with you ought to be sensitive to that? ought to be sensitive to your views as opposed to putting you down or saying something that's just nasty.
And they'd probably say yes. Yes.
Oh, yeah,
you
sure,
should be.
of course. Okay. So do you think this applies across the board? That we speak to people in general in a way that takes their feelings into account and doesn't hurt their feelings? Okay, that's another question, right? But you can see where I'm going with this, probably. Okay, yeah, of course we do. Okay, do you think that there might be some people in this room that are offended by all the F-bombs you've used? Fair question. By the way, is there anybody in this room offended? You might even ask that. And maybe some of the Christians will raise their hands, maybe not. But okay, well, if I know I'll raise my hand, okay. So do you think it's important to be sensitive to people like me and be tolerant to people like me so that you don't hurt our feelings by the language you use? Okay. Now, I actually don't think in discussions like this, people having hurt feelings is meaningful, but they do. Oh, you hurt his feelings. That snowflake is melting.
Yeah, I don't know if it's the right I don't know if it's the right perspective to take or not, but I want my conduct to be in such a way that I'm not purposely trying, but if someone is hurt by the message I'm presenting, I can't do anything about it.
That's right. Well, this is right. This is why I think this is a faux objection, like it's a false objection. I was Topeka, Kansas. Can't remember the name of the school. Did a public talk on the problem of evil. Pretty good gallery, about 300 people, I'd say. And first question at the mic was a professor of philosophy. That's how he identified himself. And then the first thing he said was, "I'm offended." Well, professor, that doesn't count. I'm sorry. I didn't say that. I had to be very careful because of all the people listening. But what was in my mind is, professor, that doesn't count. You could see your ideas are faulty, are flawed, are false, but that they hurt your feelings as a grown man who's a philosopher, that doesn't count. And it wouldn't count in your class either. All right. So do you have anything more substantive to say except for your feelings are hurt? No, I didn't say any of that, but that's all running through my mind. I did address it in a very careful way because I'm trying to be diplomatic, but I'm just saying straight out, that's a silly ethic. But nevertheless, they hold that. So we can leverage that ethic against them by maneuvering with the questions that I just offered.
So then let's change the situation just slightly. We're not objecting to the way they present their information. And this has not actually happened to me, thankfully, yet. Probably will at some point. You're confronted with a person who's, say, obviously male, identifies as female, and demands that you or me as a Christian call him or her. And I mean, it's not just one-on-one, but everybody's introducing each other. You're in front of the class. What do you do when the attention?
Right. Yes. Okay. Now there's a couple of steps involved here. Keep in mind that you only use third-person pronouns when you're talking to someone other than the subject. Okay. So are you saying that when I'm not addressing you at all, you want me to use the pronouns that you prefer? Yes. Why should I use your pronouns you prefer when I'm not even talking to you? I want an answer to that. Do you see? I think this is childish. It's very childish because it has no ramifications for them at all. And even if it did, it might be childish. But I'm just saying clearly it's childish. I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to accuse them. I'm going to ask for clarification. And by the way, in the game plan, the first step of the game plan is to gather information with some form of the question, what do you mean by that? Okay, so let's just fix that right now. You get in a circumstance that's tough, like you're describing, and the first thing you do is you don't worry about winning them to Christ or, dealing with the whole argument or being clever or anything like that. You want to gather information. And now I'm gathering information in this case because I know where I want to go with it. But notice the first question is this what you're saying? That why would you care how I referred to you with regards to what pronouns I used with how referring to you with other people? I want to know that. Okay, I want to know that. So I don't know what that person is going to say, but and I deal with it when it came up, but at least if you say yes, I want you to refer. Why should I do that in private conversations, which I have with other people, when nothing about your feelings is at stake? Well, because blah, blah, blah. Well, doesn't that seem kind of controlling to you? Okay, let me ask you another question. So I'm role playing again. So let me ask you another question though. Is it your truth that you're, let's say, I think it's a female trapped in a male body in this situation?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Is that your truth? Notice I'm using their language here. Is that your truth? Yes, of course, it's my truth. Okay. Well, why are you demanding that I live according to your truth instead of living according to my truth? So notice how I'm just leveraging their kind of nonsense words, but against them. So I'm waiting for an answer. It's all a question, right? It's a question. I'm not making any case. I didn't say anything about my view. I'm just asking, why do I have to do what you say? For what reason? Especially if it's not my truth. I have a different truth. Why can't I live according to my own truth? Now, I don't know what they're going to say. I don't know what they can say because I'm using their values against them. Go ahead.
I've often wondered that because people say, is your truth my truth? Well, if it's, and I'm never sure how to say this because I want to be respectful as much as I can, but if it's your truth, there's no reason why I should care because it's just your truth and I have a different truth. If it's not just your truth and it's an objective truth, that defeats what you just said.
Right. That's right. Well, that's fair. And I think you're really onto something, obviously. But the problem is the person you're talking to is not going to be able to figure that out in the 5 sentences you used,
No.
Yeah, that's right. Because they just don't get it. They don't get it at all, Am I morally obliged to live as if you're according to your truth when I'm by you? Now, if they say, yes, of course. Now, that is an absolute that they're offering. But the thing is, it still works against them. Okay, then why don't you do the same for me when you're with me? You should be affirming my truth when you're with me, if that's the way it works. Okay. If not, it sounds like, okay, it sounds to me, and I could be mistaken about this, that all you want is everybody to act as if they believe your truth, not their own. Is that right? Doesn't that seem self-centered to you? These are questions. I notice all these questions. I'm narrowing it down. Okay. So what I'm trying to do again is to leverage their view against them, their kind of implicit moral view against them. And of course, their view is a certain type of tolerance, a certain type of your truth kind of stuff. But these things are all essentially self-contradictory. Mm-hmm. And really what it amounts to is I want everybody to live the way I want them to live. That's it. And by the way, even those around them who are piping up against you because you're not using the right pronouns for this person, even if you were talking to them privately and not the person in question here, they'd still want you to use the right, the pronouns that the transgender person prefers. To which I have a question, why? Why should I do that with you? Your feelings aren't at stake how I refer to this other person, and I'm not referring to them in a vulgar way. I'm referring to them as according to their physical sex. Why do you care about this? See, but what's going on here is an enforcement of a narrative. It has nothing to do with being sensitive to people and nice to people, because if they really cared about that, they'd be sensitive and nice to your alternate view and leave you alone. But no, they're going to gang up on you. Tell me why I have to follow your rules on this. Okay, here's another thing adjacent to this, and what I might say to the group. Okay, what do you call a Christian who says one thing is true, but who acts opposite? What do you call that, fellas?
A hypocrite.
A hypocrite, right. Okay. Why are you then demanding that I act hypocritically regarding my own views on this issue?
Oh yeah, and that leverages. They say we're hypocrites all the time, and sometimes we are, certainly, but it's like, well, you're asking us to be exactly what you condemn us for.
That's it. That's the catch right there. And by the way, as far as hypocrisy goes with Christians, I actually think, keep in mind what hypocrisy is. Hypocrisy is a hypocrite is a faker. A hypocrite is a faker. It comes from like Shakespearean acting, and they would have different people that would play different roles, and they put a mask on. Okay, that mask reflects the role, then they'll switch masks or something like that. And those were called that's where the term hypocrite comes from. And so what you're doing is you're pretending to be someone you're not really. And that's called a hypocrite. So when you Christians pretend to be all holy roly and then you do all these nasty things, that's hypocritical, is the way they put it. All right. Now, I don't think that most Christians are hypocrites. I think phony Christians are hypocrites. Real Christians may be, here's an important distinction, may be inconsistent. That's true of all Christians. Yeah, we believe it's wrong to lust, fellas, but, that's something we struggle with, right? Just because we lust doesn't mean we're hypocrites. We really believe it's wrong, but we don't live consistently with that. That's a little different. It's not like we're faking. There are Christians who fake it. They put on a big show and they're real nasty behind the scenes and all sorts of things. Okay, that's a hypocrite. So that's just a distinction that might help you. I don't think most Christians are real Christians, followers of Jesus, are actually hypocrites. I just think they struggle with being consistent because that's the human condition. All right. What's interesting is also the only way you could be challenged to be a hypocrite or even inconsistent is that if you have a high standard that you're trying to live up to and you're promoting. Of course, a lot of these guys can never be hypocrites because they don't have any standards at all, whatever. And so charging a Christian with hypocrisy actually there's a deeper revelation there. That's because Christians care about morality and how we live. And so anyway, there's another thought.
So this is related, sort of what goes right along with the transgender issue, the homosexuality issue. We got discussing that in a class a little more recently. And one of the folks in my class was upset because Christians discriminate in their church employment, who can be pastors and who can't be, based on gender and sexuality. And the class thought this was wrong. So I asked, is it wrong? Is it wrong to discriminate? So yeah, it's wrong to discriminate. So then go off of that. Would it therefore be wrong for a secular business owner to discriminate against a Christian who believes that marriage is between one man, one woman for life? And they thought there's nothing wrong with that. And I said, folks, can you see the inconsistency there? But then you get questions, well, why do you think that marriage is just between a man and a woman? How would you go about, you're in that kind of situation, you're in a classroom and you've already stepped in it, so to speak. Yeah. And now you're committed.
Yeah, let me say this, Will. I think that the questions you just shared with us that you used in that conversation were superb, absolutely superb. The right kind of questions. They give their responses, and then it just goes to show that they're not consistent at all in their view, and so it's okay to discriminate against Christians, but not in virtue of homosexuality in a church environment, no less.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and keep in mind, the church is a group that is identified by a certain set of beliefs. So why would we want to put a pastor in there that is completely inconsistent with our set of beliefs? Okay, so what about the LGBT coalition? Would it be okay if a Christian who thought homosexuality is immoral to campaign to be the president of that organization or one of the functional members? Is it okay for that? No, they don't believe what the group believes, so they don't even belong there. And this is something that makes no sense at all to me when they reject it, but they're not thinking about it. Groups are defined by certain things. If you disagree with the definition, you're not part of the group by definition. Okay. But I think you're really on a good point when you say about discrimination. I think it's okay to discriminate in this circumstance. And they said, yes, that was the inconsistency. Everybody discriminates. Everybody discriminates. Maybe more before your time, fellows. In conscious remembrance, the Boy Scouts were a great organization that one of their principles was to be morally straight. for their young people. And then homosexuality came up. Well, that's not morally straight. You are discriminating against homosexuals when you say that. Therefore, we're not going to let you use our building to have your meetings in. Well, what is that? That's discrimination against the Boy Scouts. And so everybody discriminates. We will not tolerate discrimination. Therefore, get out of here. Leave. Don't say anything more. You can't be in our building. What is that? That's a discrimination. Jesus said didn't object to all judgments. He said your judgments ought to be righteous judgments, not unrighteous judgments. And condescending, self-righteous judgments were wrong. That's Matthew 7:1 and following. But there are other judgments that are appropriate. Everybody makes judgments. Okay. So let's see. Read that. I just kind of got an introduction on that. Read that question to me one more time.
How would you explain once you're committed? People start asking, so why do Christians think that homosexuality is wrong? Why do you think marriage is between a man and a woman?
Okay, so
I mean, they do not see it like that.
No, they don't. Okay, so the first one's harder to explain. I'm just saying the first one's harder to explain because it takes some observational wisdom of people to understand why homosexuality is wrong, and people don't have that wisdom anymore. Okay, but the second one about marriage, same-sex marriage, here's where you ask a question: what is marriage? What is marriage? Well, when two people love each other. Okay, what if it's an 8-year-old boy and a 20-year-old man? Can they get married? Hey, love is love, right? No. Okay. Well, now you're putting restrictions on marriage. Okay. So what is your definition of marriage that justifies the restriction that an 8-year-old can't marry a 20-year-old, both males? You see, there's a presumption that people are making. And that presumption has to do with marriage, what it's about, but it's very, very nebulous. Okay. So what we want to do is get more precision with marriage. Well, is marriage just living together? No, because gays could live together. They could own property together, do all kinds of stuff. Something else happened in the Obergefell case in 2015, Supreme Court. What happened? I'm tossing this out to the group. So what happened? Oh, that's when the Supreme Court said that you have to allow gays to get married. Okay, what do you mean get married? If you press them, they means that government institutions have to validate this union in the same way they validate a heterosexual union.
And
okay.
I brought up the Obergefell, I think it was Scalia who said, you open up this door, how far down the road are we going to go? And I'm not sure if they see that, but I mean, when you think about that makes sense. It logically leads.
Right. This is called I'm glad you brought this up, Will. This is called a logical slippery slope. Now, sometimes people make appeals to slippery slopes that aren't sound. But this is because logical slippery slope is when you have a principle that justifies one thing, and the same principle applies to many other things too, if you take the principle seriously. So this is what I just did when I talked about the 8-year-old boy and the 20-year-old young man. If it's love, then what if I love my dog? Can I marry? Will the government, okay, now this is what's really key. Will the government issue me a marriage certificate with the dog? And I paused there because I remember I wrote an article once. It was titled, "You Can't Marry Your Canary." Okay. And the idea was if love is just the foundation, then anything that you love and want to be unified with, the government is going to have to give a certificate. And keep in mind, marriage is all about the government.
Yep.
Making a universal claim or make a broad claim about this relationship. We are acknowledging that this relationship is the very same as a heterosexual union. And that's why we're going to give you the same certification. It's about certification by the government. Now, the government is the people, right? So that means the people are all certifying this relationship as being the same. The question is, are they the same? They're not the same. And if they were the same, I mean, I had a doubles partner for many years, tennis. I played tournament tennis for a lot of years. And his name was Mike. No government agency certified us as a marriage. And I love Mike. He was my best man at my wedding 25 years ago. He was a very close friend. Why not? Because there was no compelling interest for the government to do so. All right. So this gets down to the question of what marriage is. And this is where I'm going to try to press them on defining it. And when I press them on defining it, they're going to come up with loosey-goosey definitions that are going to automatically include a whole bunch of people that it seems silly to say that they're married, you know? The fact is that before Obergefell, gays did everything that married people could do anyway. They could, walk down the aisle and pledge their troth until death do them part and share property and, virtually everything. There was a couple little incidentals that they couldn't participate in, but the law made provision for most of those unions, but that wasn't enough for them. We didn't want to be allowed to act a certain way. We want the culture to declare they were exactly the same thing. Okay, in what way are they exactly the same? Heterosexual and same-sex unions, what are they the same? Well, love. Love is what does it. Well, you already had one counterexample to that, right? I said, so if people aren't in love, then they're not married? If marriage is about love, then half the people in the world are not married. Who thought they were? Including maybe your parents. I mean, you see that couldn't be the reason why.
It'll annul half the world's marriages, as you say in your book.
Pardon me?
It'll annul half the world's marriages, as you
Yes, of course. Of course. So notice that these are questions to get people thinking. I'm not going to change their minds right away. All right. But hopefully there's some kind of sense of continuity in thinking and fairness in thinking, or that might begin to eat at them, or the what do you call that? That phrase when you have a conflict of ideas in your own head, your own beliefs. It's I can't think of it. I'll think of it in a few moments. But we're just trying to make that happen. So I call it putting a stone in their shoe. I want to get them thinking, okay? So you think love is love, right? What does that mean? I'm curious to find out what that means. It's actually a meaningless tautology. They might as well say A is A, B is B, dumb is dumb, stupid is stupid, green is green, okay? But because it's so vague, and they're using the word love on both sides, it sounds nice and it sounds profound. So I'm not going to say that's stupid, and I wouldn't say to them, dumb is dumb, because that's an attack on them. But I am going to ask them questions about this. I don't understand what this even means. You say A equals A. That's actually the law of identity in logic, but it has no relevance here in this discussion. It's just a rhetorical move. One way to deal with rhetorical moves is to ask questions about it. Just like that. What does that mean? Notice that that's our first move in our game plan. What do you mean by that? Just to get clarification. And it's amazing how much progress you could make just by asking for clarification. All right. And that's what I'm doing here. Now, when you get down to nuts and bolts, there is a reason why cultures from the beginning of time have regulated and privileged what we could call a classical marriage, man and a woman, okay, for life. There's a reason why they've done that, because as a rule and as a group, and by nature, long-term heterosexual unions produce the next generation. That's the reason that marriages are regulated and privileged. That's what we have. Certain things you can't do if you and you must do if you're married. There are other things we're going to help you and we're going to privilege you because you're married. Okay, that means we're going to give you tax breaks for all your dependents. Well, this gay couple doesn't get those tax breaks. Yeah, because they don't have any dependents. It doesn't apply to them. And so the government is trying. Now, why is that important? Because the production of children is the foundation for the next generation of culture. And so we need to protect that whole process. You don't have to have a Bible to figure this out. We're just looking at the nature of reality. So this is an example where a biblical truth is easily discernible by simply observing reality. and paying attention to it. But this is not what these folks want. They don't want to, they just want what they want. And I understand that it's a highly narcissistic culture. And so they're going to use goofy arguments to sanitize what they want. Love is love. We're not hurting anybody. We don't get the same rights as other people. Oh, wait, Mike and I didn't have the same rights as married people. It's because marriage doesn't even apply to same-sex unions. Okay, how about this? You're a male, right? Yeah. Can you have a hysterectomy? No. Isn't that a violation of your rights? No doctor will give you a hysterectomy. Every doctor you go to says no. By the way, I've used that illustration a lot in the past, but you can't use it so much anymore because now if men can get pregnant, then men can have hysterectomies.
At one point, we were talking about a trans individual in a book, which I felt like I could do this because it's not personally attacking anyone in my class. I was asked my view on it. And I said, I think it has to correspond, your identity has to correspond to reality. And the example I used is I could identify as correct, and my pronouns could be, yes, you're right. And that doesn't mean I'm correct and I'm always right. That just means that's how I feel.
Right.
But before go ahead.
That's a fair response, but it largely falls on deaf ears because this suggests that most people in their language are interested. Their language is meant to communicate that they care about the moral life and they care about individual rights and that kind of stuff, and self-authentication kind of thing, being individually authentic. But all they really care about is about doing what they want to do and being what they want to be. The relativist doesn't think there's anything morally wrong, and so they have the freedom to do anything. But they do not want others to be relativists towards them, because somebody might then kidnap them and make a sex slave out of them. And who's to complain? Oh, I shouldn't say who's to complain. Who's to say that's wrong?
Exactly.
The complaint is relativistic, but that's wrong is objectivistic. And so on their view, and this is what we're talking about, we're trying to show them that your view is not going to get you what you really want. It's going to get maybe you what you want, but this culture can't live that way. We can't function that way. And this is what we see happening. No rule of law at all. It's just chaos and abuse. People with the power abuse the power. Right now, the people with the power are the left. Not the right, the political right, not the conservatives, but the leftists. They have the power everywhere, and they're abusing it everywhere. And these dialogues you have with people are examples of that, the way they talk about this and what they say.
I think it was Oz Guinness when he came on that said, when you get rid of truth, there's only power left.
That's right.
One last question before we.
Oh, that's interesting. I know Oz. I never heard him say that, but that is in Street Smarts actually. That statement that it's either truth or power. Mm-hmm. So I'm flattered to think that Oz thought the same thing as I did, but on that. But that's actually in Street Smarts. Truth or power.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it makes sense when you think about it, because if you don't have truth, what's left is power. And that's why it's a problem for you. And you've got Christians in a society that doesn't care about truth, or because the Christians have the truth. So one last instance of something we might run up against in class, just briefly before we wrap up. I don't know if this will actually be brief because it's a big issue, but nonetheless, talking with the science professor at one point, and I objected. I don't remember what it was, but some leading question on a test. And I asked him about God, and he said, well, there's absolutely no evidence for God. I mean, categorically, there's no evidence at all for God. And that intelligent design is pseudoscience, and it shouldn't even be allowed to, be taught or mentioned in schools, really, because there's no evidence. Very, very dogmatic.
Right.
Where ought the Christian student go when they're confronted with this kind of a professor?
Sure. A couple of thoughts on this. One, you can ask the professor, what kind of evidence one would marshal regarding God would you consider legitimate evidence? I don't mean proof, because we're not talking about proof here. Remember, when you are dealing with a man who's accused of a crime that he did not commit, the only reason he gets accused is because there's some evidence that seems to point to him. May not be conclusive, but there's still evidence, right? All right. This guy says there's no evidence. So you want to ask him what would count as evidence towards God. I have a feeling I know what he would say. He would say something like, well, God would have to stand right here in front of me and, say the Greek alphabet backwards or something like that, some ridiculous kind of thing. In other words, it's going to be a standard for evidence that he doesn't apply to anything else in his life. All right. But he's doing it that way to be able to say there's no such evidence for God. Okay. Now, the books are filled. Christian books are filled with all kinds of arguments and evidence for God. And if you look at the history of philosophy, okay, all like 11 volumes or whatever. Can't remember the fellow who put it all together, but if you look, it's a common reference series that if you're in a philosophical program like I was in, you find helpful. Up until the Enlightenment, virtually every single one of those philosophers whose thinking moved the world, this would be after the time of the ancients like Aristotle, etc. And since the time of Christ, virtually every single one of those in the Common Era were Bible-believing Christians. Like Thomas Aquinas, one of the most brightest guys that ever lived. Now, it doesn't mean he's right, but it seems to me it's pretty bold to say, no, there's no evidence for God. All right.
What this guy said was they're all wacky, all of them down the line. I gave a few instances, and he's like, no, they're all whacks. You wouldn't want to believe them.
Okay. Yeah. So this is way it's very self-serving to say that Thomas Aquinas was a wacko. And I don't know how many of your listeners know who Thomas Aquinas is, but a whole field of philosophy called Thomistic philosophy was his bag, so to speak. Now, he could have been wrong on a whole bunch of things, but to call him wacky, excuse me, that's pretty far out there, This guy that you're talking to probably has never even read Thomas. I suspect it's not easy to read because
I asked him if he'd read any intelligent design scientist, or I didn't ask him that. I asked him if he could name me one intelligent design scientist, and he couldn't. And I said, sir, with all respect, know there's no evidence, but you haven't read any book. You can't even name to me anybody who would actually disagree with your perspective. I don't know how you'd know.
Well, that's a fabulous question. It's great. I couldn't have done better. That was perfect. And with all respect, this is part of my point in Street Smarts and a dialogue there is there's no evidence. Well, who have you read to find that their comments were completely wanting and their thinking didn't even rise to the level of evidence, much less conclusive evidence, right? Who have you read? Characteristically, you're going to get people responding the same way that your professor responded. Well, if you've never read these people, how do you know their arguments aren't good? Another question. This is entirely fair. Okay. Now, to say Copleston, by the way, is the author of that 11 volume set, Copleston. And why is it that the greatest world thinkers from the time of Jesus up until the Enlightenment were all Christian theists? I mean, they're wacko. Okay, well, Professor, let me offer. Do you mind if I ask a few questions? No, I'll say first. A couple are easy. Okay, but just play along with me. All right. Do you believe that things exist? Yeah. Okay, so do I. Good. That was the easy one. Here's another easy one. Not a little harder, but all the things that exist now, have they always existed, like forever and ever and ever and ever, no beginning? No, of course not. Big Bang cosmology. They came into existence at the Big Bang. In other words, there was when there was nothing, and all of a sudden there was a bunch of stuff, right? Yeah, that evolved. Yeah, okay. Okay, I understand that. I'm with you that about the beginning too. So here's my last question. This is the important one. What caused the Big Bang? everything to come into existence. Now, there's only two options in general, make it easy, either something or no thing, something or no thing. So what do you think? What's your view, Professor? Now, he doesn't want to say something because now that's something outside of the material universe. It had to be pretty powerful. It had to be pretty smart. It had to be a person to initiate the chain of events. They call that agent causation. He didn't want to go there. So he's only got one other alternative. No thing caused everything with no reason, no purpose. Really? Okay, you're welcome to that. But do you think that's the odds-on favorite? And by the way, that's a miracle.
Mm-hmm.
Just saying. So you're saying a miracle happened that wasn't directed by any divine creature. It just happened on its own.
It's the classic Norman Geisler, don't have enough faith to be an atheist.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And notice I'm using a version of the cosmological argument called the Kalam cosmological argument here, but I've just put it in a series of steps, and he's helped me out with the steps. And now he's got to say, okay, so you say apparently it's wackier to believe that some powerful being outside of the natural universe made the universe. That's wackier than the universe just popped into existence out of nothing. Okay, well, you're welcome to that if you want to. By the way, how many other things do you see around your house or around the community that just popped into existence out of nothing? Well, don't tell me quarks. Don't tell me quarks. That doesn't count. Quarks are itty bitty, little bitty things. You're talking about whole giant things. Everything is what you're saying, not just a quark.
What came out of the discussion is nothing would convince the guy. Like, I asked him if it was written on the clouds, your name, I'm here, believe in me. Because I heard in a debate, Michael Shermer of Skeptic Magazine said he didn't believe that.
I've debated Michael myself.
So I asked him about that. Well, no, it would be aliens. I asked him about why he thinks he could trust his thought process. And his answer amused me, and I don't know if he ever realized why, because he compared his brain to that of his cat's brain. And I thought that was an interesting response, because I'm like, that probably doesn't help your case here.
It doesn't. It just, normally I would say kick the can down the road a little bit, but I could say kick the cat down the road a little bit, because the same question could be asked of any sentient being, how they trust their thought processes to give them truth about the world when their whole mechanism of thinking was accomplished by accident, not by design. This is precisely how science started, by the way, with virtually every single founder of modern science, whether it's Boyle or Newton or Galileo or I almost said Cornelius. That's not the right Copernicus, or any of those guys. They all were biblical theists, and they all started. They all launched the whole scientific revolution because they believed that the universe was intelligible because it was made by an intelligent being. And things could be followed in a cause-effect event causation kind of way. And learning more about the nature of the universe allowed them to learn more about the nature of its creator. So, religion wasn't a science stopper. It was a science starter, as a matter of history. Incidentally, that dialogue that I offered a few moments ago about the atheist and the Big Bang, that's in Street Smarts. And so is the information about Bible and science. That's all there, with appropriate conversation. So this is all in the book. And so most of what I'm offering you now is not just the technique, the Street Smarts technique, but it's also which is the tactical game plan played out in these different areas, but it's also easy to do and very effective, if you begin to employ it. So, and when the professor says that's pseudoscience, then I want to know what pseudoscience is. Oh, that's like astrology. Okay, explain to me, though, why intelligent design is pseudoscience. All you did was compare it to something else, but you didn't explain why that comparison is a legitimate one. So now, by the way, I'm using the second step of the game plan. The first step is to figure out what a person believes. Oh, you mean that's pseudoscience? Then he gives a definition. Okay, why do you think it's pseudoscience? That's the second question. That's the second step. You're trying to make them give the reasons for their own view. I call it reversing the burden of proof. But so there's your first two steps. And notice the safety in those steps. You're not taking on any blame, anything on yourself, any risk on yourself. Okay. So these are then you can get into the third step of using your questions to make a point. But a lot of times when you just ask for clarification and reasons for, you're going to get dead air. Okay. So yeah, pseudoscience. Why is it pseudoscience? Oh, it's kind of like astrology. Well, okay, what is it that makes it like astrology? Well, you got God working, and therefore, well, you can't have God in science. Really? Well, all of the founders of modern science believed in God and saw his hand working in the natural realm. So why would you say that you can't include God in science when all of those men did that? It strikes me as arbitrary. Help me out. Why would, see, I'm waiting for him to make sense of this. Well, it's pseudoscience. Oh, wait a minute. So it all, because it doesn't appeal completely to natural effects, natural law working on matter alone. Oh, okay. Now I get it. Now he's asserting materialism. That is a philosophical view called materialism, though. Why would you assert and enforce materialism into the scientific process? Okay, I want to know his reasons. All right. And by the way, what do you think about forensic pathology? You use science to find the bad guy. When you find out whether a murder has been committed, or whether a person died of natural causes or by foul play. Okay, is that legitimate? Sure. Well, what you're doing is you're inserting an agent potentially into the circumstance. Why can you appeal to agency in forensic pathology or in archaeology all the time? Here's a flintstone. Looks like it was struck by a human. So you're appealing to human agency there. And why can't you do it with, say, the origin of life or the origin of the universe? Why isn't the first an example of pseudoscience? See, they can't carry this on consistently. They have to assert this view so that God can't get his foot in the door, as one has famously said, Richard Lewontin, and that quote is in the book as well.
I believe his major thing was specifically young Earth creationism is pseudoscience because it can't be falsified. And then he went on to say that young Earth creationism was wrong. And I pointed out to him, or I asked him, it can either be pseudoscience or it can be wrong, but by definition, if it's by your definition of pseudoscience, it can't be wrong because you just said it couldn't be falsified.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Well, I'm really impressed with your questions. They're great ones, and I actually don't think young Earth creationism can't be falsified. All you have to do is show solid, reliable evidence for an ancient universe, and therefore young Earth creationism is falsified.
Yeah,
now,
exactly.
So I don't understand that. I'll tell you what can't be falsified is materialism. At least not from his perspective. I think materialism can be falsified, but a guy like that is not going to take any evidence to the contrary. He doesn't believe in souls. We're just meat all the way down, right? Mm-hmm. So we're just wet machines. Okay. I asked, I was at a university once during a Q&A, and I asked a young man, I said, who raised an issue on this particular point. I said, do you know what you're thinking right now? He said, sure. I said, how do you know that? Are you feeling it, tasting it, touching it, smelling it, hearing it? No, you're not using any of the five senses. You know your own internal states by direct awareness. You're directly aware of those things. That means they're not physical. Okay, a thought isn't physical. A thought doesn't extend in space. It doesn't change with physics and chemistry. It's not subject to those laws. So how can you claim that thoughts are not immaterial? So I think there's lots of counterexamples that we all know about, and I give some samples of that. But when I have debates or discussions or something like that, don't do many debates anymore. Actually, I don't do any anymore. I'm tired of that. I'm too old for that. Too much work right now. But you see the point. Materialism is falsifiable, but not according to him, because it's an absolute. It's an a priori. Before the evidence is in, we are asserting that there are no forces outside of the natural realm, no God. And therefore, if you bring God into the picture, it's not real science, it's pseudoscience. It's a self-serving way of thinking, but it's not a sound way of thinking.
Well, we really appreciate you coming on the podcast like this, and I really hope that these instances are representative of what other students are going through, and that there's helpful stuff on the podcast. And folks, if you haven't already gotten the gist, go pick up this book. Highly recommended. Pick up Tactics as well. Help you maneuver conversations. So that wraps up the latest edition of the world's one and only apologetic satire podcast. Again, the book is Street Smarts, Using Questions to Answer Christianity's Toughest Challenges. We want to thank Greg Koukl again so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode of the Rock Solid Apologia Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, go ahead and like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Also, go ahead and share with us in the comments how you found out about us. We'll see you next time on the next episode of the Rock Solid Apologia Podcast.